The leaders go, great, I'd like to delegate more, but I can't. They're not capable. I said, well, they're not capable because you haven't developed them to be more capable. And I'm not talking about their skill set. I'm talking about their maturity. How well are they systems thinker? Can they see the big picture? Can they make decisions for their whole? You've kept all the knowledge to yourself all these years.
What if the key to extraordinary business success is hidden in plain sight? What if companies are more than just machines, but living organisms with unique energy fields that fuel their performance? Today on Seek, Go, Create, discover the magic of the living organization with Norman Wolfe, our guest. Through his journey from a struggling team leader to a sought-after consultant, Norman uncovered a revolutionary model that reframes how we can think about business. Join us as we learn how to define your company's soulful purpose and uncover the secrets to sustainable success. Norman, welcome to Seek, Go, Create.
Thanks, Tim. That was a wonderful introduction. You're happy. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I am looking forward to it too, man. You've got such a rich, anyway, this whole concept of the living organization, we're going to dive into it shortly, is just so fascinating to me as I've been studying it. I actually saw it even this last week in some work that I was doing. We'll talk about that later on, but let's kind of do I don't even know if I could call this an icebreaker anymore because it's sort of a weird question, but you have a choice. The first question that I ask, would you rather answer what you do, kind of the networking question that we all get when we're out and about, or who you are? Which one do you choose, and just go right into answering it?
Well, what pops up in my head is who I am. And I'd answer it by saying, I guess I'm a seeker, which is appropriate for your podcast. How's that? I've always been described as a map maker. I look to unravel the secrets of life. I have since my early 20s and trying to figure out how do we as people and creating the results we create, and how can we get more of what we want and less of what we don't want. And I've delved into all sorts of fields of interest, disciplines from physics to spirituality, and trying to figure out how do I make life work, combining being a seeker, curiosity, and passion for understanding with this notion of being able to frame ideas, complex ideas, into simple, hopefully understandable ideas, I guess is how I would define who I am.
Thank you for tying into the title of our podcast. I appreciate that. And I do feel like
intentionally.
I do feel as if it was heartfelt and not just some kind of, trying to blow smoke. Thank you. I appreciate that. Can you recall when you first realized that you were someone who was a seeker, someone who asked questions, someone who wasn't satisfied with the status quo? And both of you, for those that are listening to this, we're mature men. We're not college age or even in the first half of our lives. We're towards the tail end. When do you recall being aware of that, being a seeker?
Oh, I know exactly when it happened. It was 1968, the summer of 1968. The trigger mechanism for me was the Chicago Convention. You probably are old enough to remember it. I certainly lived through it. I was raised in a fairly modest, middle-class Jewish family. My grandparents were immigrants from Russia. They were evicted during the pogroms. And so growing up, I had this cultural orientation to the relationship of the United States versus Russia, which was the big totalitarian state that was the evil empire, and we were the good guys. Right? And I'm watching the Chicago Convention. I remember the thought was, this is impossible. This is Russia, not the US. Something doesn't jive. And the thought in my mind was, if this belief system that I had isn't true on my current experience, my living experience, what else was I raised with that might not be true? And that opened the door to, I couldn't live with the uncertainty forever. I remember actually creating, I was at the time going to NYU, studying mathematics and engineering. And I remember having a need to develop some path forward. And I created a hypothesis. I said, if I'm going to try to figure out the truth to life, the real answers, let me start at the beginning. And I said, I'm going to start exploring the nature of life. Now, everybody around me was saying, everything comes from God and God is this. And, but the experience was there's a lot of different messages, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, what's the truth? And, where can I find the truth?
Leaders, let me ask you a question. Are you driving your organization forward, or are you just reacting to the daily chaos? If you're feeling stuck in the weeds, constantly putting out fires, and struggling to focus on the big picture, it's time to shift gears. As a leader, your greatest strength is your ability to think strategically and proactively. That's what leading is. But I get it. When you're caught up in the day-to-day grind, it's hard to step back and develop a clear plan. That's where I come in. I specialize in helping leaders like you implement strategies that move your leadership and your organization from reactive to proactive. I'm offering a free 30-minute coaching call to help you identify actionable strategies to become a more proactive and strategic leader. Whether you're preparing for a new season, tackling fresh challenges, or just ready to take the next step, this call will give you clarity and direction. I guarantee it. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Start leading with purpose and strategy today. Book your free coaching call now by hitting the book coaching call link in the show notes or visit timwinders.com/coaching. Let's work together to take your leadership to the next level. That's timwinders.com/coaching, your first step toward leading with focus and intention. Now, back to the show.
And I created this hypothesis that said, I'm going to believe in a God. There's one God, because most people say that. I don't know if it's true or not. But it seemed to me if there was one God, there was going to be a single message. Now, being pretty astute at public speaking, even at that age, I realized that when you present something to somebody, you want to present it in the context from which they understand, right? I could make up a story that said, well, there's one God and he's just presenting his message through different contexts, which gives birth to different religions or different stories. But that was just a hypothesis. I didn't know if it was true or not. And I held the possibility that it wasn't true, that in fact there were multiple gods, or there was one God that was being sadistic and giving us different messages. So the theory behind that hypothesis was if there is one God and there is one message, I should see patterns in all of the different scriptures, if you will, or theories or presentations that were common, maybe said differently, but they had similar principle. Probably spent the next 20, 30 years of my life just open to that possibility. So that was the trigger mechanism that put me on this journey that even today doesn't stop, looking for common patterns that could reveal a truth that any one perspective doesn't have in total.
That's good. So 1968, how old were you?
20, that summer was 20, turning 21.
Okay. And for some people, we might need to give some context to that convention. Bobby Kennedy was shot and killed. Was it at that convention or right before that? Is that correct?
After that, I think, or right after that, like the following. So that whole period of time, John Kennedy's assassination, the Chicago Convention, Vietnam War, Robert Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination, a whole disruptive set of events over less than 10-year period of time.
I was born in 63, 3 days before JFK was shot. So I don't know that time frame was as significant because I'm a question asker too, but I also look for how it fits into some of the bigger systems. I think it's so powerful that you just shared what you did about the time frame. So here's my second big question. That was sort of my first big question. You're a mature guy. You've done a lot of things, seen a lot. In 1968, you said you were seeking truth. Are you any closer today to finding that truth? Or, like me, does it still seem somewhat elusive and you're still asking a lot of questions?
Well, that's a really good question. I, being a map maker, as I say, collecting all of these comparisons and ideas from multiple disciplines, seeking the nature of life, if you will, and how it works. I do have some frameworks that I have developed that feel like it's the truth. But I've also been on this journey long enough to know that the minute I find a truth, it reveals a whole lot of other questions that are yet to be discerned and discovered. So I don't know if there is a single truth that could be wrapped up in a nice package, but I do feel the framework I've developed and live by is actually embedded in a living organization framework, has a lot of validity and is supported by a lot of different perspectives. If you look at it contextually, not so much literally.
And the reason I love you tied it into the living organization, because as I was looking at your stuff, and I know that you and even I and what I do, we apply that living organization to companies, businesses, maybe organizations. I work with some ministries and things like that. But truthfully, Norman, as I was looking at it, and I love the way this has started off, I actually looked at it as cultural. I actually looked at it as nations. I looked at living organizations in a lot of other contexts with the way you were framing it. And, you've got context, you've got the energy, you've got other things that are part of that. Is that valid? Is that something that crosses your mind and all that? That, when you talk living organization, it applies to me, my family, my business, my company, my country, my region, this 55 and older community that I'm in, correct?
You're absolutely correct. And I give you a lot of credit to be so astute to discern its true nature. Remember, I sought out to answer the question, how do we create what we want? How do we get more of what we want? Well, I should say, how do we create what we get? And how can we get more of what we want and less of what we don't want, basically? Um, when you think of a marriage, so again, personal experience, I was married and divorced 3 times, and I was going through my third divorce and had a child from that marriage. And my former wife and I were really committed to making decisions based on what's good for the child. And so I observed both myself and her making decisions where I'll call it the desire for being right, or the ego mind, you might say, wanted certain decisions. But the other part of me knowing that making that decision might give me a win, but would end up hurting my daughter. And I watched her make similar compromises for the good of our daughter. And that gave me a really interesting perception because, okay, like I said, I was married and divorced 3 times. And as I was entering my fourth marriage, I began to reflect on, well, there's you and there's me and there's my wife, Jane. But there's also that thing we call a marriage. And we started to use the term usness, right? It's like a living thing that encapsulates us. And what if I applied that same principle of doing what's good for the third entity? In my divorce, it was my daughter, but what if I focused on the third entity as the thing I wanted to make my decisions for? That takes it out of her versus me and brings it into us. And so any decision I make is good for me and good for her, right? And that and so you mentioned it's good for you, it's good for your family. Keep going, right? And so anytime you have a collective of people who come together for a common purpose, it gives birth to a living entity. So now look at an organization, right? You've got a collective of people that come together to form the organization. As the organization grows, it's like another, it's like mitosis, right? It splits and creates other living entities. It's called functional teams, sales, marketing, operations. And those are collective of people for a common purpose, provide sales for the good of the organization. And that collective of so now the organization is made up of people, and it itself is a living person. And you just keep scaling it. It doesn't matter. Now, we stop at the business and organization level because that's the domain I'm interested in, but it absolutely does apply to keep going. It's companies make towns, right? Towns make cities, cities make states, states make countries, countries make, the world. So it absolutely is. You're very astute at being able to discern that.
And it's not possible for them to operate in a vacuum. And that also creates challenges, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, the nature of life is, we call it ecosystems. It's really just a collection of people in interdependent relationships. That's what, a simple way of thinking of an ecosystem. And we're ecosystems within ecosystems. It's all about the nature of our relationships. And our relationships have a huge impact on us energetically, and it can either attenuate our energy or amplify our energy.
Yeah. And the thing, I mean, we're recording this in January of 2025. It's probably going to release towards the tail end of January, February, where in the United States, for those listening here, we will be sort of having a changing of the guard. I am not going to have a political conversation here, but there will be some changes with that larger ecosystem that companies operate in. I've got a client right now that 100% of their inventory comes from China. We had a strategy session a few days ago, and we've been discussing this because we kind of saw this coming. There's some very interesting things going on, but that leads to kind of one other big picture item before we kind of start really going into maybe a little bit more granular. And that is one of the things we discuss here, Norman, is kind of defining success and redefining success. And one of the things I think that some people have a goal or perception of is perfection. I think they're attempting to obtain perfection within individuals, organizations, and things like that. And because something is living, it's my opinion that number one, perfection is unattainable. It's impossible. Stop it. But my question for you is, how do we measure success within a living organization that includes all of those sub organizations and those bigger and smaller? How do we start going about just thinking about success? Maybe not exact measurements, but give us a mindset for how we should think about succeeding.
Well, you mentioned earlier, I think in the introduction, the notion of soulful purpose. I believe all living beings, whether it's an individual, really come into the world for a purpose. We spend most of our lives trying to figure that out. I probably found mine 15, 20 years ago when I started on this journey with the living organization. So it's not something you can, I mean, it is a journey just to discover it. But we all have a purpose. I think businesses are a little bit easier because they are created with an intention from the beginning, right? And in that intention, the owner, founder, entrepreneur starts something, and he's trying to typically, I mean, there's a few that started just to make money, and that's the really rare case in my experience. Most of them see a problem in society, in their world, in their industry, and they think they have a way to solve it that's better than anybody else's. That's really the essence of innovation and entrepreneurship. And so every company is started with the seed of an intention, which we can call it soulful purpose. Why was it created in the first place? And what problem is it trying to solve? If you fall back to that and say, okay, if this is my soulful purpose, how do I see being successful look like? And we call that a vision of the impact of the future you're going to, or a vision of the future of impact you're going to make, right? And it's not really a vision statement like most people talk about. It's really a narrative. Think about 20 years from now, or 50 years from now, or 10 years from now, and you fulfilled your purpose, or at least made progress towards fulfilling it. What changes happened? What impact have you made? What does it look like? Think of it as like a journalist is telling your story. What does that look like? And you combine the soulful purpose with the impact statement, the impact story, I should say, that you're making. And you can always use that to say, are we getting closer? Are we making that defines true success, right? Now, there's a lot of other factors. It is not only what you're doing, but how you're doing it, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of growth and development, a sense of maturing, a sense of belonging. Those are some other, I consider, three of the key innate needs of humans. Um, we want to grow and develop, we want to make a contribution, and we want to belong. So those are other characteristics we can use to define how we are doing it. Are we doing it in ways that enable us to feel more human, or are we doing it in ways that detract from that humanness?
But as a mathematician, I'm an industrial and systems engineer. What we really want to do is measure things better. And
Yeah.
some of those things you just mentioned, Norman, I'm sorry, I'm thinking through. You can't measure those. So how do you really know? How do we really know if we're succeeding in this living organization? How do we I mean, even if you're leading it or if you're in it, how do you know?
The very essence of that question stems from what I would call the mechanistic paradigm, or the machine paradigm, right? You kind of knew you were leading me into that, didn't you?
I know that. That's where I'm going, man. I'm pushing you. I'm pushing you. My
Or
first rodeo, man. I know where we're going here.
it really, just the way the question is framed, comes from the fact that we believe everything can be rationally, logically defined. That works in the machine paradigm. That's exactly what you would do with machines. But when it comes to a human being, that's necessary but not sufficient. There's two parts to us. There's the subjective part and the objective part. They're both valid. It's not one or the other. That's a mistake we make in the business world. It's the hard side or the soft side. That's a silly bifurcation that should never have happened. Part of the living organization framework is actually designed to integrate the two back together like they belong. How do you know you're in love with your wife? It's not something you can technically measure, but you know it. It's very clear you know it, right? Businesses are the same way. And what it requires is to re-honor, bring back the value of the subjective elements. Now, there are ways to evaluate subjective elements of it. At the end of the day, it's sort of like the old statement, I can't tell you what it is, but I'll know it when I see it. And it's okay to trust that. Part of what we do is teach leaders how to trust their gut, how to trust the feelings. That we actually teach the skill, we call it heart centering, right? Teaching the skill to tune into the subjective elements of life because they're very valuable. And especially if you want to do things like create psychological safety, you can't do it from the head. I don't care how many processes for it and how many structures you put in place. The only way I feel psychologically safe is if I feel you get me and you honor me as a human being. And I can only do that for you if I am truly in the place of connection, which is really the heart center. There's a nuance and a lot of application challenges with it, but that's the general path we want to follow.
Yeah, one of the things, and I know you've got a background in what we'll call large corporate with Hewlett-Packard.
Yep.
My first job coming out of Georgia Tech in the late 80s was with Bell South Corporation, probably, similar mindset, similar process, et cetera. And one of the things that became such a pet peeve of mine is there were comments, and I think it was trying to get at what you've developed here, Norman. So let me say this, and then I'm going to let you respond. Was within these small pockets of the organization within Bell South, they would use terms like we're a family. And I would look around and I'm going, you know what? We just fired so and so. We just, we've got this union issue that we deal with that's combative. We just got rid of the leader and we're looking for a new. And I said, and I was young at the time, but I was asking a lot of questions like you did and all. And I was going, I don't think this is a family. To me, from talking to you, I think that was a cheap attempt at describing a living organization. And I think it's caused some problems because I don't think business is a family. So now that I've gone on my mini rant, what would you like to say about that? Because you probably lived through that too, right?
Oh yeah, some people ask me what started your path besides what I said. So I come out of that period of time to add to the genre of that time. Not only do we have all those major events, but we also had the hippie movement, right? The free love movement and all of that. I was also influenced by that. And I come out of that kind of university environment and go to work at Pratt& Whitney Aircraft. And I'm literally told two statements stuck in my mind from back then. The first was, I was probably there 6 months, and my supervising engineer came to me and said, Norman, when you come to work, you leave your personal life at the door. Okay, how do I do that? I'm not sure what part of me I take off and hang up on the hook at the end. I couldn't figure that out. Literally, it was just cognitive dissonance, if you want to call it that. The second one, probably 2-3 years later, I'm kind of in the groove of part of a team, and we're loving what we're doing. We're having lunch one day and talking about how much we love it. Same supervising engineer comes in and says, "Gentlemen, work is not meant to be fun. Work is work. If it was fun, you'd be paying us to go like you go to Disneyland. We pay you to work," and worked out. And we all looked at each other like, was he nuts? That's the cultural norm that I grew up in, right? And unfortunately, that paradigm, remember, paradigm is a way of thinking. It's a framework, of set of belief systems about how life works and how we're successful. And that paradigm has influenced generations upon generations to think of what is business, what is organizations, what is it, and how do we respond. It's also very strongly separated the employees from the leadership, which is another fundamental bifurcation. So I say all that as kind of a contextual framework to say what you're pointing out to is this desire amongst leaders, especially, to represent the organization as humanistic, as a family, a caring organization. And their behaviors, not because they don't believe what they say, but because they think of implementing what they say in a certain framework, causes that same cognitive dissonance, that same experience of that's not true that I had when they told me to leave my personal life at the door. And so that's why I'm committed, and all the work I'm doing now is not just coming up with another framework, another model, but I'm really committed to changing the paradigm. It's sort of like trying to convince classical physicists that quantum physics is a better way of understanding the world. And they're going, huh? That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit the way I understand things. And that's the challenge I'm facing with my community of consultants, is helping leaders go through that gut-wrenching reframing of the way we see the world. And it's really challenging. So I see it all the time, what you say. I experience it. And I experience on both sides. I experience employees so used to being cogs in the wheel and going into battle with management. Not only do leaders have to change, but the employees have to change as well. They all have to move into a new way of understanding what their role and relationship is to the collective. Imagine employees who came to work because they wanted to contribute to the purpose of the organization. Think of that possibility for a second. Leaders wouldn't have to manage them. They'd have to help them grow and develop in the capability and maturity to fulfill that desire on their part, to contribute. It's just like me going back to, I wanted to make my marriage successful. I was committed to the usness. It wasn't me versus her or her needs versus mine. And all that comes up, but it gets resolved if we all focus on the usness. Organizations would actually not need to exist because there'd be nobody to battle with. And management wouldn't see employees as their most valuable asset or the most valuable stakeholder. I actually wrote a blog arguing that employees are not the most valuable stakeholder, because a stakeholder by definition is somebody or some group that's outside of the collective, right? My investor isn't part of my organization. They're outside. My suppliers are outside. My partners are outside. Even the regulators are outside. So all the stakeholders I deal with are outside of the organization. That's sort of the definition of a stakeholder. Well, to say an employee is a stakeholder is to say they're outside of the organization. Now, just think about that. That's kind of bizarre. So my article was, take away investors, take away suppliers, take away clients, take away all of the stakeholders we deal with, and you still have an organization because you have a group of people committed to some purpose. Take away the people,
It still exists.
you haven't got an organization at all. You don't have an organization. You have one individual's probably vision. That's what you're left with. And if that's leadership, they're all alone. There's nothing for them to do. It's not possible. So the collective is really the important thing. And we want to shift the paradigm so that leaders and employees really understand what the true nature of what it's about. It ain't easy because we got so many years of thinking, but that's where we're going. Just to add on to it, you see a lot of movements. I don't know if you saw Bayer Corporation just completely went through or self-managing autonomous teams. They're completely restructuring. Higher Corporation created this model called Redefining, which is micro enterprises. Everybody's an entrepreneur working together in collectives. There's a clear desire for some movement, and our framework helps facilitate that.
But here's the interesting thing about those two examples you just brought up. Someone younger might go, oh, this is so new and creative and innovative. That's been tried before, correct?
Yeah. It really has many times.
That's not new.
No. And it's probably more appropriate to saying we're going back in time. We're going back in time when the subjective and the objective were together. They weren't separated. The scientific revolution basically separated that.
Right.
And we've got to bring it back together.
So when someone like you is attempting to change a paradigm, you could probably tell where this question's going. And we want to be able to at times know how well we're doing. Are we really moving the needle? Are we making progress and things like that? And I want to kind of frame this and say that there are times that Tim can be extremely optimistic and Pollyanna-ish and things are great. And then there are times where I could be extremely pessimistic and go, oh my goodness, I'm a living organism. How are you doing? How do you grade this paradigm shift, this movement? Now, I know you're probably interacting with people that are embracing it, but if you step back and look at culture and look at the bigger organization, how do you assess the progress?
Well, like anything at a societal or global level, you have to look at long-term patterns. And I've been around long enough to be able to track many decades of patterns. So some of the indicators I use, first of all, I don't think I'm alone in this journey. I think I'm but one voice of a chorus of people trying to sing in a new way of being in business. You've got movements like the Teal movement and conscious capitalism, and you've got people like Brendan Hyatt Corporation, and you got Bayer Corporation and Zappos, Birchog. I mean, there's a lot of people who are evolving. I remember when I left HP in 1988 and started consulting, I think it was in the early 90s. I came across a consultant out of the East Coast that had an award called Love in the Workplace. Because back then, you couldn't even use the word love in a business environment. So he actually created a word like love in the workplace. Now that's not such a big deal because it's okay to use those words. Right? We saw the creation of B Corps, another movement to try to stimulate a shift in the paradigm, if you will. Business is not just about maximizing shareholder value. Business is about purpose. And you see a whole cottage industry of consultants coming around on all they do is focus on helping organizations to find a purpose now. That's sort of maybe 5, 10 years older, sort of declining, but there was a big rise in the purpose cottage industry. I wrote the book. It was published in 2011, and talking to people about that then, yeah, I was like talking about love in the workplace in 1988. And now I'm having conversations with people like you who get it, who see it, who feel it, who sense it. And so I look at the trend over many, many decades and say, we're making progress. I feel in many ways that this movement is beyond all of us. It's something life wants to manifest itself. It's a shift in the way we've lived for a long time. That's time for the next iteration of it. Um, I think it has a lot to do with, you'll hear me say, it has a lot to do with balance. So bringing back the objective and the subjective, the head and the heart, balancing opposites. I think that's a big part of what this next evolution is bringing. Um, I'm just one voice of a chorus of people making the impact I can in my own way. I now have a community of, well, by the end of first quarter, will be 12 of us. I'm bringing on 4 more people. A year ago, there were 2 of us struggling a lot. And now people are saying, wow, I like it. I resonate with it. I want to be part of that. I want to help this transformation. So those are the indicators I use to keep my life feeling like I'm making a difference. All this effort is paying back. Those are the subjective indicators that I would use to say we're being successful.
Mhm. Well, I think the descriptions, the soulful purpose, while I don't use that language in what I do because of my spiritual background and things like that, I actually believe that the thought process, and I was exposed to your stuff a few weeks ago or when you came onto our radar as far as being a guest. So I believe that there probably is a movement. And I guess one question I have is, do you think that all that occurred with a worldwide pandemic accelerated that? And I'm also going to layer in another question. Do you also think there's some generational trends that are occurring? Because I'm tail end of baby boomer, you're probably baby boomer, and we've got this hard charging, authoritative, leadership kind of baked into us. I do wonder if some things that are occurring are accelerating. What are your thoughts?
Yes to both. I do think that the so-called major crises we've had have been stimulants to disrupt the existing pattern of thinking, causing many of us to think there's got to be a new way. I'll go back to 9/11, the Great Recession, COVID, the pandemic. These are major, major disrupting forces. Um, Prior to the pandemic, there was a few of us that used to do Zoom. Now I don't have to travel anywhere. I talk to people all over the world, right? It's commonplace, right? Whether we stay with remote work or hybrid work or go back to the office, there was a shift happen. Something new was born into the collective zeitgeist, right? The collective culture, the DNA. So yes, I think those major events do shift things. I think the major purpose of it is to shift things. The second part of your question was
Generational, just some generational things, a younger group, there's always generational sort of conflict built in with leadership. And, we're having these generations. We're dealing with this with one of our organizations right now that there's just a different thought about work ethic, different thought about the office, different thoughts about just the way work gets done. Maybe not right or wrong, it's just different.
Yes, about, I guess it was maybe a little over a decade ago. I saw a pattern that I think is still at play. You're right. I'm at the beginning of the baby boomers, so I'm at that transition between traditionalists and the baby boomers. You're at the tail end of it. It's a pretty long generational cycle. And one of the things I noticed about myself and then watched a lot of the baby boomers move into is a desire to seek purpose in life. You're right. We're hot charging. We were authoritative. We wanted to take control and all that. But as we move into the 40s, 50s, 60s of our lives, and for me, 70s, meaning and purpose started to become more important than things. Millennials seem to come into the workplace with a desire for meaning and purpose. And certainly Gen Z is known for meaning and purpose is a dominant criteria for them. So what you have is two fairly large demographic populations, both seeking to view life differently. No longer is it acceptable to leave your personal life at the door, so to speak, right? Meaning and purpose and doing something that contributes to the positive of the world is important to us generationally. Not everybody, obviously, we're still all individual humans. I think that has a huge impact on the direction we're moving to. We struggle with it, or we struggle with finding balance again. I mean, you think of it, not to get political, but even in the just geopolitical climate we're in, where there's a shift from neoliberalism to more of a conservative, I won't even go so far as the right wing, a balance, right? We swing too far one way and we got to come back somehow. I think that the nature of life is always back and forth, the polarities, without getting into the physics of it all. But the challenge is to find the balance where you're going back and forth in slight iterations instead of big swings. So yeah, I think we're faced with a number of different forces happening that's stimulating this change. That's part of why I said this is beyond individuals. This is life unfolding. This is something bigger than us as individuals. And the more we can get in line with that, the more we'll be successful, because you can't fight nature, so to speak. Humans think
Yeah.
conquer Mother Nature. I'll double down on my bets on Mother Nature or anything.
Well, being a systems guy myself, I sometimes ask the question, are we attempting to force something into a structure that's not structured correctly? You mentioned you had a Jewish family background. I've studied some of the Middle Eastern culture with Old Testament and Christian and all that. And it seems to me that there's more of an integration of all of the factors of life within that culture. Whereas we're a product of the Greco-Roman segment everything in your life. Work goes here, your hobbies here, your marriage here, your children. And I do wonder if that is one of the big hurdles. And I'll ask you if you think it is, or what are some other of the big barriers that we're facing to continue moving this message farther along?
Wow, big barriers. So first part, answer to your question, yes. And it goes back to what I said, this notion of integration of opposites, right? Or the balance of it. And it's not just in Judaism. You look at Taoism and the Tai Chi symbol, the yin yang symbol. It represents balance. And we talk about how people would love to live in a world of harmony. Well, harmony by definition is balance. One of the biggest challenges we have, and it's not just the Roman Greco era that probably started it, but I think it really got kicked into with the scientific or in industrial revolution, right? This notion that we want to objectify, we want the Newtonian theory that we can take nature and put it into its simple clockwork gears, and we can understand it and we can control it. Ever since then, we've been living by the scientific methodology. If you can't explain it, repeat it, objectify it, it's got no value. But we know that's only partially true. And again, I'll never throw out the objective structure, systems, numbers, That's half of that's the head of the tail. We got to bring the tail or the head of the coin. We got to bring the tail of the coin back into union because the coin is made up of both sides, right? Objective, subjective, head and heart. Um, Now I'm just going to focus on business because that's the domain I play in. Some of the biggest hurdles, I think, and why the paradigm shift happens is we keep thinking of people and in business as component parts of the machine. And as component parts of the machine, as a leader, designer of the machine, I define the spec sheets of it, what I need for the machine to operate. I go to my big box supply store, we call it employment agencies. I give them my spec sheet, we call them job descriptions. You see how we just tied into this whole machine paradigm. And I buy these component parts and I plug them into the machine. I say, this is what you're designed to do. Well, that's okay to some degree. And it works really good in what I would call operations that need very structured, very defined, very repetitive tasks. And that's why it was designed in the 1900s, because that's mostly what we had. But humans aren't really designed to be that way. And we got more than just our doing machine, so to speak. Right? We got relationships, as we talked about, and we got the stories that make up our context, our belief system. And so I look at the concept of maturity, and that's something that's never thought about in the machine paradigm. If you look at one of the things that makes us capable as people to create outcomes, level of skill is one half of it. A level of maturity is the second half. Maturity gives us the ability to deal in more complex environments with more diverse points of view, with more uncertainty, and navigate through it. I mean, as I've gotten older, I believe I've gotten more mature. Some of the things I've observed that happens to me and how I've changed, I no longer fight for my rightness, so to speak. I no longer have to be the expert. As a matter of fact, the less expert I am, the more powerful I am. Right? That's a maturing process. If we look at business, what we fundamentally have done is lock people in at a childlike state because they're the child and the leader is the parent, and the leader is supposed to take care of the children and tell them what to do and how to do it. One of the challenges, one of the blockages I faced in shifting the paradigm is the leaders go, great, I'd like to delegate more, but I can't. They're not capable. I said, well, they're not capable because you haven't developed them to be more capable. And I'm not talking about their skill set. I'm talking about their maturity. How well are they systems thinker? Can they see the big picture? Can they make decisions for their whole? You've kept all the knowledge to yourself all these years. Time to develop them. Now, I also want to say that there are environments where that is appropriate. And there's some very environments where a very more structured environment is appropriate. And you're going to have less mature people. That's the starting point. Even within an organization, I'll have positions that are starting point. Those people will need more direction. I don't want to keep them there. My job as a leader is to not just move them up through the organization because they may grow past the organization. My job as a leader, just like as a parent, I want my kids I don't want my kids living in my home when they're 35, right? I want them to be mature and capable of taking care of themselves. Why don't we do that for our people in the organization? Why don't we view our role as leaders as developing them? So one of the biggest blocks is in the shifting of the paradigm, especially in business, is helping redefine the role for both employee and leader. I believe it starts with leader because they obviously set the tone, just like maturing for most families is a function of the parents' responsibility to help their kids mature, not let the kids mature on their own without guidance from somebody who's kind of lived somewhere along the line. So that I think is probably the biggest block and why it's important to recognize this paradigm shift because that doesn't make any sense. What I just said makes no sense. If I view my role as a leader as optimizing the machine of production.
Yeah, I love the term maturity. I seem to use the word health quite a bit. I ask, what's the health of the organization? Maturity, oddly enough, and I don't know if I was reading through your book at the time and I got this, or if it was just what came to mind, I've got a leadership team I'm working with. There's a few that are on the leadership team, and their discussion, it's a very young company, is no one below our level is taking responsibility. They're not being accountable. And the analogy I use is like and I'm not stating this in a negative way, they're in middle school. And we've got to move them up a grade or two so that they can learn how to drive and maybe go to the grocery store for us and do some things. So I love that. I love that maturity. And I've got a few, I think, what I call big questions here as we're sort of coming in for a landing. The first one, and I would love for you to give maybe how to proceed. Let's just say someone has been listening in and they love the thought of this. It might be something that resonates with them, deep down in their soul or their gut. They go, yeah, you know what? I've been doing some of that without defining it, but I want to do more. And I know that especially people that are coaches like you and me, our first thing would say, well, give me a call. We'll help you. We can make that work, but let's maybe don't go that self-promoting here. What would be a good first step? What's some things that the leader that's listening in should do next, Norman? Get the book might be one. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But what are some first things to do if they're aware of this?
Well, I laugh because that was the first thing. I mean, this is a complex journey, right? And you need a guide. So first thing is find a guide. I'm available now, but you do need a guide because it's not easy. And one of the things I teach all of our consultants is what I call empathy and compassion for leaders. Without that, forget it. The second thing is whoever that guide is should have a deep understanding, not just be empathic and compassionate for leadership. Um, but understand that the number one role of a leader is to create the results that enable the organization to sustainably grow now and into the future. And so we can't just talk about the soft side. We have to acknowledge that their role is to ensure the organization is performing. So this is a journey. I often use the term we're retooling the production line while the production line is running. We don't have the option to shut it down and train everybody and now turn it back on. And this is an organic process. I would strongly suggest that leaders learn what we call it, heart centering, right? How to start bringing in the subjective element of life and to get comfortable with that. That to me is a foundational skill to shift, not only in being a good leader, but being a good human. But let's just focus on running a business. And there's a lot, we teach a methodology, we call it heart centering, but it's really a form of, you can use meditation, you can use relaxation, mindfulness, whatever you want to use. With heart centering, we use a lot of the same principles and practices, but we recognize that we're really dealing with the body as an energy field, and we're learning how to consciously shift the energy patterns and opening to insight and wisdom. It's just sort of like, think about those aha moments you have at 3 o'clock in the morning or when you're taking your morning shower. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to have a tool or the ability or the skill to allow you to tap into that wisdom in the midst of a crisis, not just the next morning in the shower? And so this is a skill, and I want to highlight it as a very practical skill. It's not just meditating or often going into la la land for peace and calm and relaxation. It's actually a very valuable tool. So that's one of the places I would suggest people start as a leader, is to start learning that skill. And then the rest of it is applying that skill. But always keep the eye on the ball that you're here to have the collective, the organization, produce the results necessary. So you need the business side of things, and you need these often called the soft side of things. And you got to bring them together into an integrated way of leading.
Right. Norman, I just realized here we're at the tail end of our conversation and we kind of dove into the deep end of the pool right at the beginning. Kind of as my almost final question, did we define the living organization well during the course of this. Is there anything else you would like to say? I know there's a lot to it, and we're about to let people know where they can get the book and connect with you and all that, but anything that we missed? Do we need to do a definition here as we're wrapping up that maybe we missed earlier?
Well, I think I've touched. I didn't present it in the way that I normally do. Uh, we we we've as I've said, I wrote the book in 2011, and it's evolved into a framework that got three component parts. It's a new way of seeing. It's the core principles, the paradigm shift. And what are the principles of those paradigm shifts? It's like, what are the laws of quantum physics versus Newtonian physics? The second is a new way of leading, which is 6 skill sets, and it starts with heart centering, then heart centered communication, reframing context, the ability to create that collective context that shifts from the old strategy to the new, so people behave accordingly. So context is a big part. Probably didn't get into that as much as I normally do. Um, the fourth is improv mindset. The fifth is balancing opposites. And the sixth is we call it leader as coach sultan, because you're still a leader, that's sort of directive and all of that, but you're also a coach, and how do you combine the two? And then the third element is a new way of creating results, which is a set of tools that we've developed to facilitate, to bring the two together, to bring the objective and subjective into with some tools that support that effort for you as a leader. The living organization framework, I think, is I'll state my bias, I think it's a pretty darn good way of proceeding as the next step. But there's a lot to it. We're going to be coming out with a new website, thelivingorganization.com, pretty soon, probably within the next month or two, which will explain all of this. They can actually go to thelivingorganization.com now, but it takes it to my website, quantumleaders.com, which starts the discussion, so you can find a lot of information there. They can actually get the first 3 chapters of my book for free, download it from quantumleaders.com/podcast. And they can reach me at nwolfe@quantumleaders.com.
I'm going to encourage people to reach out. It's a great fit. Listen, anyone who's listening in here, what you're discussing, it's a great fit. There's a reason that we had you on as a guest, and I think you could tell just the way my mind and my heart works that, I would have no problem arguing with people. I'm sure you wouldn't either, but there's no reason for us to argue over anything because there's so much in sync. And I love that. Norman, we're seek, go, create. You already said you're a seeker at the beginning, but I'm going to give you an opportunity as my final question to pick one of those words, or allow you to, or force you to, or whatever, however you want to word it. Seek, go, or create. Which one just means more to you, resonates more with you? Even right now, don't overthink it. Seek, go, or create, and why? That's my final question.
I would jump on create. Why? I think humans are inherently creative beings. We manifest realities. Learning how to do that, it ties back to the very thing I talked about. Create exactly what you want in life. Get more of what you want, less of what you don't want. And I think that the inherent nature of people is to constantly seek to improve the environment we live in. So create a beautiful world for all of us to live in.
Norman Wolfe, thank you. Thank you for integrating terms like the living organization and soulful purpose into what we're doing here at Seek, Go, Create. They fit so well. They're so powerful. This has been a great conversation. I encourage you to connect with Norman. He gave you his coordinates. They're going to be down in the notes. If you're watching this on YouTube or listening in on your podcast platform, listen in. We are Seek, Go, Create here. We've got new episodes every Monday on YouTube and also all your podcast platforms. I appreciate all the comments you've been making. I would love it if you're watching this on YouTube for you to jump down and give your thoughts on what you think about the living organization and some of the things we discussed here. I'd love to hear positive, negative, anything. I think it's helpful to have that dialogue. So thanks again for listening in. Until next time, continue being all that you were created to be.